great. Thank you for having me. What a brilliant introduction, I think. The name of the company, the P is PeopleSoft, just so you know, in case no one figured it out. I don't know why you couldn't. Are you not allowed to say that? Oh, okay. So anyway, I spent 10 years at PeopleSoft or so. So we'll talk about that as we go through the session. First of all, wow, that's a bright light. Who's here? Who's here? How many of you are in HR? How many of you are in IT? How many of you are in other? I always love the other categories. How many of you love public speaking? Oh, awesome. Can you come up on stage? Bring your device. We're going to do a little experiment. Okay, what's your name?
Dr. Honey Laverne Barner.
Dr. Honey Laverne Barner. Great to meet you.
Nice to meet
Jason
you.
Averbook. Are you digital?
Yes.
You are?
Yeah, I think so.
How long have you been digital?
All my life.
What? Brilliant. Raise your hand if you're digital. Oh, see that? When you public speak and no one raises their hand, what do you do?
Or you just move on.
Okay, take out your device. Everyone take out your device. Hold it up in the air. Point it at us. Wave it back and forth.
I like it.
How's that look?
It's good. It's cool.
Yeah. Now, what is that? Now, does anyone ever been to a concert where that's happened? Or a sporting event? Okay, now what was it before digital? Before you had this? Okay, so you've all been digitally transformed. Does that make sense? You've all gone from the lighter to this. You are all digital. Okay? Thank you. Well, you can stay. Thank you. So we're all digital today, and that's what I want to talk about, is this world of digital that we live in. Really quickly, about LeapGen, our company is focused on helping organizations make a leap. And leap, you might think of it as jump. Leap in our world stands for love, energy, audacity, and proof. How do you love what you do, which generates energy to do the audacious and to continue to prove value? Raise your hand if you love what you do. Yeah, we're all here if we love what we do. You know, there's a woman last week that was in one of my sessions in Australia who said she didn't love what she did. I was like, oh, well, what do you do? How many of you, actually, one more question. How many of your parents raised you to be in HR? Wow, really? Your parents raised you to be in HR?
My mom was an HR director.
Nice.
And my grandmother was an HR assistant. So
Wow, an HR director and an HR assistant. So you're a third generation HR species.
now my daughter just graduated college, and her first job out of college, HR assistant.
Wow, 4 generations of HR. Well, she needs a round of applause. So it was really interesting. In Australia, someone said, my mom didn't teach me, or my parents didn't raise me to be in HR, but they raised me to care about people. And I was like, impactful. So it wasn't about the title as much as it was the role. So when we think about what we're talking about with transformation, we're talking about how do we care about people, but in this world of digital that we live in today. So watch this video real quick. Actually, I'm going to go back and do that, start it over. Watch this video real quick and think of some of the words that you hear. I'm going to ask you in a second.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So what are some of the words you heard in that video? Crazy. Troublemakers? Who said troublemaker? Oh, you're the troublemaker. Troublemaker. Misfits. Rebels. Change. I'm sorry? Moving humankind forward. Round peg, square hole. Wow, you guys listen. That's awesome. Yeah. So when you think about that video, and you're going to get copies of this presentation so that you can go back and give it to your teams, like I'd ask you to think about our job in HR, because our job in HR is trying to do that, is trying to change. And what we have, as clearly witnessed by 4 generations of HR, one of the oldest professions in the world. Now don't take your mind to some other place. But we have one of the oldest professions in the world. This profession that we've been, from personnel to HR to counting people. And I like to say, how do we shift from counting heads to making heads count? From counting heads to making heads count. Now, back in my days at PeopleSoft, we were only focused on helping organizations count heads. And people said, if we could just know how many employees we had, it would be great. The world has changed so much from then, and I'm going to ask you throughout the presentation to keep an open mind to the words that you just heard in that video. And I'd like to start with this quote. Now, forget who said it, whether you're a Jack Welch fan or not. The quote is what's more important here. If the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. One of the things that's fascinating to me, and I'll love your thoughts on this, is that in the last 5 years, 5 to 7 years, we all have better technology in the palm of our hand than what our organization gives us to work with. Agree or disagree? We all have better apps in the palm of our hand, personally, than what our organization gives us to work with. Agree? Disagree? Disagree? Yeah, well, that's good. We're going to get back to you in a second. You're coming on stage. No, so all of that said, if you think about how many of you didn't check your device this morning? Same guy. What do you have? Do you have DOS? He needs help. Someone help him at a break. He's a genius, needs a Genius bar. But when we think about that, the rate of change on the outside has exceeded the rate of change on the inside. And what does that mean? The expectations have changed forever. The expectations have changed forever. So when we think about that, it's not just the technology, it's processes. Things like, do we measure people once a year? Do we ask our kids once a year how they're feeling? Do we check email once a year? We don't do anything really once a year, yet we do a lot of HR things still once a year in a cycle. So when people go from the outside world and then enter work, how do they feel? Not so good, except the DOS guy. So when we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, are we communicating with our employees? And when I say communicating, are we paying attention to them and providing them an experience in the year we live? So it's 2019 outside of work. Hopefully everyone agrees with that, even you.
No, I feel like Jack Welch. The end is here.
We have a very positive guy in the audience. So it's 2019 outside of work. What year does it feel like inside of work? From a process standpoint, from how things happen, what is your, and guys, it's an important question, what's your chasm? So it's 2019 outside of work, when people get inside to work, from a process standpoint, from how fast things get done standpoint, from a can they check on the status of things, what year does it feel like? 2000. 1980. 1950. Your grandmother, right? 1950. So when we think about that, that's big, right? So that chasm, and that's really only the last 5 years, is one of the things, it's one of the things that people are deciding whether or not they want to work with you. Does that make sense? It's one of the reasons that people make a decision as to whether they should work in your organization. How easy is it to get stuff done, or do they spend 40 to 50% of their time doing stuff that's not the job they were hired to do? That is a huge question for your organizations to ask themselves, is what's that chasm? And what can we start to do to fix that? And that's what we're going to talk about throughout the session here. Now, to start with, I talked about the word digital and digital transformation. And I hate the term, but I'm going to help you guys understand it, and you can come up with how you want to use it. So first of all, digital is not just technology. Okay? So a lot of people, when they hear digital, they're like, IT. That's not what digital is. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But digital transformation, and some people like the word transformation, some people don't. I like the word maturity better. We're all maturing digitally. Like a lot of you been to the concerts and did that thing? We're maturing, right? We're all trying new apps all the time. We're all trying new AI tools. Now you're like, we don't use AI. Well, guess what? If you use Google Maps, or you use Waze, or you use Uber, or you use Lyft, or you use Tinder, we won't go into those, you use AI. Okay? You don't think you're using AI, but it's embedded in what you're doing. So when we think about digital, I'd ask you guys to think about this equation. And if there's nothing else that you take away, I would love if you'd all leave and get this tattooed on your body somewhere. Okay? These 4 things: mindset, people, process, and technology. Mindset, people, process, and technology. We're going to break them down in each one individually. But first, mindset. What's my vision? People. Who are the people that I'm designing my solution for? This is one of the biggest mistakes that we've made, and I'm not going to even call it a mistake. That's why I paused. The world has changed. When we roll out HR technology, who did we design it for in the past? HR. Us. Now in the world we live in, where the workforce is ready to engage, what do we need to do? Change our design, to focus on how do we design for the worker. Does that make sense? Instead of designing for us, how do we design for the worker? How do we think our processes should work based on understanding our people and designing for them? And then once we do that, and only once we do that, should we jump into the technology pool? Does that make sense? Now, where do we oftentimes start? Technology. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you're like, oh, how many of you have ever watched a software demo? How many of you start to drool? Oh, I watch this all the time. If we just had those dashboards, if we just had those reports, and that's all great. That's the technology. But guess what drives the technology? Guess what gets you to the point where the technology works? Having the right mindset, having the right design, and then thinking about the outcomes or the processes that you want. Otherwise, if you don't do that, the technology is just a shiny object. Okay, and it's very hard for vendors like SAP, very difficult for integrators like Deloitte to be successful when you don't have that vision. Does that make sense? Because all they're doing is saying, hey, let's put this thing in and hope that it does what we're trying to do. So it's a huge component of digital. And someone's going to ask me a question about this later, I'm sure. How many of you have just been involved in technology projects where you feel like the vision hasn't been there? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you love technology and you would start with technology and hope the rest catches up? I call it SOS, shiny object syndrome. We all have it. Any of you that are addicted to buying cords or devices or have the latest whatever, we all have this shiny object syndrome, and it's something that's important to understand, that the technology is great fuel. It's great fuel, and it's better than ever, by the way. But unless we have that vision, it's very hard to succeed. Yet, one of the things that we find is that most HR organizations don't have a digital strategy. They don't have a digital people strategy. What they have is a technology plan. We need to do an upgrade. We need to build an integration. Does that make sense? They have a technology plan. They don't have this concept of a digital strategy. So what we want to do is shift from this concept of transformation to maturity. Now, what have most people done when they go from one version of software to another? Do they really transform? What do you think? No, so I've been in this space for almost as long as Andy. Not quite as long, but I'll say almost as long. So I started working and implementing payroll at a company called Ceridian Corporation. Has anyone heard of them? It used to be called Control Data. And it started on a mainframe. You remember that? He agrees with something I said. Then we got advanced and we shifted to this thing called DOS. Right? And then we shifted to this thing called Windows. Okay? Remember how we used to distribute software on disks? Floppies? Firm disks? Like our first software we distributed on disk. We had disk 1 of 47. Remember that? You'd insert 1, take out 1, insert 2, then all of a sudden you didn't have 3, and you're like, where's 3? Right? Someone forgot to give you 3. That's how we used to distribute software, which basically made it impossible for us to distribute to the workforce. Right? Then the cloud came along. And when the cloud came along, we had the ability to distribute software to a whole new group of people. Yet mostly what we've done is what? Transition technology. We haven't transformed HR. We've transitioned technology. Does that make sense? And we have to stop that because guess what we're wasting? Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Billions of dollars when all we do is transition. Okay? So we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. But the one thing I'd ask you to think about is, first of all, lift and shift doesn't work. And the second thing is, phase 1, when you deploy anything, phase 1 is more important than ever. How many of you download apps from the App Store ever? Yeah. Can I pick on you, Lynn? You're like, oh. No, I'm not going to ask you what you downloaded. But if you download... She's like, what are you going to ask me? If you download something from the App Store that you don't like, what do? What? Get rid of it. How long do you give it? Like months? Right away. And then how often do you go back to see if it got better? Okay, now think about that when you roll something out to your employees. Same thing. Think about it. They see it for the first time. They're like, effective date? I don't know what that means. Position management? Job code? How do I know what that stuff means? So what do? Abandon. They don't delete. They abandon, and what do? Talk to your business partner. How often do they go back to see if the technology got better? They don't, which means basically I spent all this money going down this technology path, and they're still going to abandon and talk to a human. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope the concept makes sense. It doesn't make sense to do it that way. But if phase 1 is nothing more than or less than what you have today, people aren't going to be like, yes, I love this. Now I know exactly what Lynn's been doing for the last 18 months, making something worse than it was before. And then there's this crazy thing called phase N. Have you ever heard of that? And people say it's coming in phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4. I call it phase N, which is phase never. Because guess what? Like, we keep promising that, but it's really hard to get them back in today's world. The attention span of people is a lot shorter. It used to be 18 to 24 months. The only people that used to care about my HR software was who? HR. And guess what? It was their job. They had to care. Now when I push it out to employees, they don't have to care. They can abandon and say, hey, I'm going to get this done somewhere else. Or the managers are going to help them through it. So we have to think different when we think about digital. So when we think about mindset, I'm going to ask you guys to think about this question. How do you focus on the why you're doing things, not the how? And every CHRO around the world we get the opportunity to work with, we ask this question. What's your why, not your how? If you can, bless you, if you can start with the why, your how has such a great opportunity to be successful. But if you start with the how, which is your technology, it's really, really hard to ever get back to your why. So what's your why? How many of you know what your why is? I know some of you are going to need some time to think about that. But what's your why? And okay, so your why is employee engagement. Now how? That's what we're talking about. But the why is how do I, and that's, by the way, a lot of times I hear this thing, I hear some people have really wobbly whys. Sorry, that's a weird way to say it, but like, oh yeah, we need to do this, and we need to upgrade this, and our payroll's not quite great. You know, that's a really good why. Okay, now let's talk about the how. The how is to create this concept of a vision. And what you see on the screen here is something called a vision map. And before you deploy anything, whether it be technology, process, just a communication, I'd ask you guys to think about using a methodology like this. You'll get copies of it. Take a picture, whatever you want to do. What's my vision statement? This should be my 30-second cocktail napkin pitch of what it is I'm doing. What's my why? What are my principles of my why? What are my attributes of my why? And then what are my measures of success? What are my measures of success? How many of you have a vision map like this? Okay, there's 2. Okay, so guys, that's something that I would highly recommend you go back and educate or your teams on, is that. How do we create that? Because once you've got that and you get it signed off on, guess what? Everyone moves in that direction. You start making decisions towards your why instead of your how. Okay? And then what are your measures of success? When you implement technology, what's the most common measure of success? If it works might be interesting, but my favorite one that I hear is go live. Has anyone ever been to a go live party? Like people gain 30 pounds, might get married, divorced, but we're live. And I actually think that's the craziest thing in the world. And the reason I think it's crazy is I think they should be called go begin parties. Because really, once you're live, you've finally paved the road, you've got the car, now we're going to start driving. Does that make sense? Now we're actually going to start impacting employee engagement. But we put so much effort on the go live, and I realize that's a hard thing. But if my measures of success are, let's go live in 18 months and be on budget, I mean, that's important. I'm not saying it's not, but we can go beyond that. I'm going to ask you, we call it the other side of the equation. How do you move to the other side of that and say, how do I tie my measures to my why? To do that, I have to realize that every organization is different. Every division of the government, as much as we'd love to say you're all the same, you have different cultures, you have different leaders, you have different types of workers. So we're all different. We have to answer this question. What do we, as a function, want to be great at versus what's it okay to be okay at? And once again, I'll ask you guys, how many of you think you have this answer? What do we want to be great at versus just okay? Because if you don't, go back to your HR leadership team and have this discussion. Or I'm happy to come in anytime, no charge, and have the discussion with your team. What's your great? What's your why? Versus what is it okay to be performing at? If you're 99% accurate with payroll, what are you? In trouble. If you're 101% accurate with payroll, what are you? Crazy. You can't be that. Okay? 100%. So in payroll, I want to be performing, right? No one's ever going to say, great job on my paycheck. Right? No one's ever going to do that. But engagement, say, wow, you've really moved the needle on engagement and people are staying. So what's your great? What's your great? And that's how you start to sequence your initiatives based on what you want to be great at as a function. And how do we focus? Forever, in all of the generations in your family of HR people, they've been focusing on the exception, not where most people are. Well, there's 8 people that don't have a device or that argue. So we can't roll out technology because guess what? It's not going to work. Don't not do it for the 8. Does that make sense? Find a way to get around those 8 and help them come along versus not doing it. We work with organizations all day and say, our people aren't ready. They don't understand the device. Do you ever hear that in your organization? Who lives without this anymore? There are you. I know you. But sorry. But for the most, but there's a room of 400 people here and there's one. Right? So let's not do it because of him. Let's figure out how do we bring him, the psychotherapy, how do we bring him along on this quote-unquote journey? The last thing I'll say about vision, and I hear this all the time, and I'd ask you guys to help with this process, is people say, what's your name? Lashana. LaShawna? LaShawn, thank you. So our focus is engagement. Our focus is culture. Raise your hand if your focus is in your HR functions, engagement or culture, or growing people, or developing people. It's the title of this conference, right? But what's fascinating to me is that people create these budgets for driving engagement and culture, but then don't include the digital component, which kind of gets us to this point of how do we deliver anything? Does that make sense? How can we possibly deliver capability if we don't budget for a way to deploy those capabilities to our workers? And the reason we don't do it today is because we call it HR technology, which is, once again, what? Technology for who? HR people versus technology or digital capabilities for our workforce. Does that make? It's a huge shift, you guys, that we have to make. We have to stop thinking about it as technology for HR because people don't want to keep spending money to make HR more efficient. You might think they do. People want to drive engagement. People want to drive culture. People want to drive why do people come to work here. So we have to break those two things apart. Now let's talk about our people. When we think about our people, I'm going to introduce you to a concept called design thinking. And hopefully you guys have done it. But if you haven't done it, it's the concept of how do we create personas for our different types of workers. Okay, and this doesn't mean if you have 50,000 people, you create 50,000 personas. Okay, it means what are the examples of your workforce? In this case, hey, here's a leader. This is a leader in the sales organization. What are her most important things that she cares about? Okay? In this case, if you look at this particular slide, her motivators are store performance, leading people, and mentoring. Here's the tools she uses. Here's her age. Here are her goals. What are the moments that matter to her? I'll say it again. What are the moments that matter to her, not to you? To her, not what you think, but what she says. And what are her expectations? Now, raise your hand if you do that, if you have this for your workers. Okay, so if you don't have that, when you deploy capabilities, I call it spraying and praying. I mean, you're just hoping. You're truly hoping that somehow you're going to fit the need of the worker without actually getting into their head and saying, what do you care about? What do you care about and what's going to drive you? And then not just that, but then how do you start to measure them along their journey? So knowing them and knowing how they think, how do you say, how are they feeling as they're being onboarded? How are they feeling day 2? Now, you see that slide? Once again, why are you laughing at my slide? The sad faces are descriptive, yes. And they're meant to be, because that's an example of where an employee starts to be like, seriously? It's 1950? Like, the career site looked awesome, and now you've got me on this intranet where it's a link farm. Like, that's where people start to become disengaged, right? And they abandon. So how many of you map journeys? Okay, awesome. Raise your hands again. You see those journey mappers back there? You should all attack them afterwards and go learn what they do. Because if you're not, employees don't work in modules. Does that make sense? You might say, hey, we have to roll out e-performance. Or we have to roll out e-time. Employees work in processes. You deploy, or vendors sell modules. Okay? No one says that's how you should roll it out. That's just capability. Okay, it's like selling you a stove. It's not telling you what to cook on your stove. Okay? Modules versus capabilities. So let's talk about processes now. And when we think about processes, there's a big difference between just automating a process and digitizing a process. Automating a process is taking an existing thing and putting it online. People do this every day of their lives in HR with something called performance management. Okay, they'll take this Word document or an online form, and they'll say, hey, guess what? We're going to move it to a new online form. And people weren't using it before, and guess what? They're still not going to use it. All we're doing is automating a manual process. Digitizing is how do I reinvent it to add new value? Is there any reason I should still be doing employee conversations once a year still? Why would I do that when I have the ability to talk to my employee and have frequent conversations every day or every week? Why would I still do it once a year? Just something to think about. The other thing that's really important to think about is this concept of touching. Now, how many of you are into touching? You don't even know what to say. HR people are like, well, if we do this, we're going to lose the high touch. I always think it's funny when HR people talk about touching. Like everyone says, we have to be high touch. We have to be high touch. In today's world, there's two types of touching, or at least that we're going to talk about. High touch human and high touch digital. Okay? High touch human, how do I leverage people where I should be leveraging people? High touch digital, what can I do to digitize the things that are rad, repeatable, auditable, and documented? Does that make sense? The things that are just standard. How do I think about those in high touch digital? And guess what? If I do that, I can deliver them with more consistency, with standards. I can do it at scale. High touch human, I can't do at scale. I get different answers, different types of questions, different types of responses, different types of tracking. It's very, very difficult. Does that make sense? So what have you done that's been high-touch digital? In the world of HR technology, we came up with this thing called self-service. How many of you use self-service? Okay, worst thing ever invented. No, it's a good start, but so think about self-service. First of all, we try to get organizations not to call it self-service, but call it direct access. How do we give employees and managers direct access to the information they need to do their jobs better? Okay? Self-service, it used to be full service, now it's what? Self-service. Most people don't like that concept. But when we think about self-service, besides entering time and viewing your paycheck, you know what the top 3 self-service transactions rolled out are? Number 1, changing your address. Sir, when's the last time you changed your address?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. Caroline?
Couple of years ago.
Couple years ago?
11 or 12.
11 or 12. So if you used a process every 3 years, 2 years, or 11 or 12 years, would you say you loved it? No. The second is getting married. When's the last time you got married? 1967. Congratulations. How about yourself? Never been married. How about yourself? 30 years ago. Same thing. Ask yourself the same question. If you used it every 30 years, or I can't even, whatever that is, how many years ago that was, would you love it? And then the third thing is having a baby. When's the last time you had a baby? How many? 10. How about you? 30. How about you? Never. 10, 30, and never. Now, I don't know, I haven't seen all of your self-service, but what's your name? Rakaya. Would you have a baby just so you could use the self-service? No? So when you think about those things, like, you put yourself in the employee's shoes. Okay? Because what we just did is we said, hey, those things are easier for me as HR. But now that I'm in the employee's shoes, and they're like, we don't love this. This is hard to use. If I use something every 3 years or 5 years or whatever that is, 50 years, it's not going to be top of mind. How many of you check your email every 3 years? Or LinkedIn every 3 years? We do things on a frequent basis. Okay? So it's really important to think about those processes. Watch this. I'm going to ask you guys to watch this video quick, and once you watch it, I'm going to ask you why I'm showing it to you.
Emma,
Emma. Emma. Emma.
Mais le trèfle waxifère, vraiment plus large.
So why would I show you that? It's an example of where we have to really think about this concept of digital. And not everything makes sense to be digital all the time, right? So think about your employees again. It's not always, let's just run everything to digital. But really with intentional sequencing, we think about where does it make sense to be quote unquote digital. Now I'm going to ask you guys to interact. Take out your device. I'm going to ask you guys to send an SMS text message. I know you can't do it, sir. To 44222. And your message should be SAPGOVT. Okay? Now, what you're doing is you're getting a copy of these slides. But we're digitizing it. Okay? So you should get a bot that responds to you. How many of you have used a bot before? Anyone get a bot yet? What's it say? Okay, so if you put your email address in, you're going to get the slides. Now, for you, if you have slide blockers on or outside blockers on, you might want to use your personal email address, but you're going to get the slides. Now, what did I do? I just digitized a process. By the way, free tool, using what? The device that you had in front of you. Okay, how many of you had to go through training to do that? Change management. Big marketing plan. The concept is that we created an experience that matches consumerism, and it was designed to make you not remember what it was, but how did it make you feel? It said, "Hi, it's Jason." It was personalized. It said, "Welcome to the SAP event." Right? It was easy. You have the slides in your email. That doesn't mean you leave because you have the slides. Just hold on. But what I want you to do is I want you to remember how it made you feel. It was frictionless. It was easy. So when we think about this concept of frictionless, how do you deliver to your workers? They're looking for frictionless. They're not looking to sign in and then 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 sign in. You get the picture. They're looking for something that's frictionless. How do I get it to them in a natural way? Okay, so the right product to the right people at the right moment through the right channel. Did you just get the right product? Yes. Who's the right people? Only the people that what? Asked for it or personalized. What was the right moment? When you asked for it, and what was the right channel? Wherever you asked it to go. Do you get that? That's what workers want. And when they have that, they feel engaged. When they don't have that, they feel the opposite of engaged, which is what? Who said disengaged? Oh my gosh, I love you. The opposite of engaged in this particular presentation is enraged. Okay, engaged or enraged. If your workforce isn't engaged, they're somewhere between engaged and enraged. And when they're enraged, and someone calls them and says, "Hey, would you like to come work for me?" What might they do? Go. We can't afford that when we think about this concept of experience. So when we think about experience, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, how do we take transactions, which are these things that were called self-service, and build interactions into them so they trust our function to create the experience. So when I change my address, what do people do today when they want to change their address in your organization? Do they go to a search bar? Do they navigate to something that says change their address? Or do they say, "I want to change my address"? What do they do? I don't know who you are. Sorry. Or do you get that? I don't know who you are. They call payroll. right? That's not frictionless. Well, maybe you make it frictionless with humans, but that's not as frictionless as most workers want to work. Okay? So when we think about this, think about what tools do you use that have a great experience? How many of you shop on Amazon? Good experience? Okay, think about if all Amazon was a buy button. Right. Yeah, yes. Because you know what it is already. Right? And you do it a lot. It's not something that you buy once every 50 years. You wouldn't have a button for that. Right? But when you think about it, it's the interaction. So when you think about an Amazon page, what's on there? A bunch of knowledge. Right? So I'm changing my address. What does it mean when it says effective date? Then there's collaboration. Reviews. How many of you read the reviews? There's an analytic. People that changed my address also did this. Wouldn't that be helpful? And then the transaction. If you think about that, I'm shifting from transaction to experience. And I'm measuring where people abandon along the way, because that's what drives that shift from engagement to enragement. Okay? And there you see that slide. So let's wrap up and talk about technology. When we think, now, do you realize I spent 40 minutes talking about nothing related to technology, but you're at a technology event? Why is that? Remember that equation, 10%? We spent 90% of our time getting ready for the technology. Now that we're ready, now we're ready for the fuel. Now we're ready for the fuel. So we want to build this concept of an anti-fragile foundation that's made up of data that's both structured and unstructured. Now, really quickly, without getting too technical, what's structured data? Data that sits in PeopleSoft, SAP, whatever your HR payroll system, that's structured data, table-driven data. What's unstructured data? Anyone have PDFs, FAQs, DOCs, XLSs, DOCs? Anyone have that stuff in HR? That's 80% of what you have, and for the most part, it's a mess. I mean, at least, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. In most organizations we work with, it starts as a mess. It's sitting on the F drive or the G drive. You do a search as to how do you take time off, you get 215,000 hits. Sound familiar? How many of you have teenagers? Anyone? Okay, so what is your teenage... so my 11-year-old's a smart ass. Excuse me. Wow, a smart aleck. He's a smart aleck. So I asked him to search for something. And he was trying to do a math thing. And I asked him to search for how to do this math thing. And he goes, why would I search? He's like, all I have to do is type it in. 8 plus 2 minus 4 times 10 divided by 3 to the exponent of 2. And I was like, okay, you're searching. He was like, no, I'm not searching. I just want an answer. It's like, I don't want a document to show me how to do that. I just want an answer. Does that make sense? I was like, whoa, dude. Like, don't you need to show your work? He's like, show your work? Like, what am I going to show? Like, did I type that in and got the answer? So I was like, huh. Like, it's great, but it's weird. I mean, it's weird for us digital immigrants. You know, I mean, he's a digital native, so that's all he knows. Right? I mean, this is the same kid that the first time I took him to get his hair cut, like, we went and, you know, the person said, hey, I'll be right back. I'm going to get a phone book, Alex. And he goes, Daddy, what's a phone book? I'm like, it's something you sit on. You know, so this is a true story. So that your head can reach the bowl. And he's like, why do they call it a phone book? Which totally makes sense that he's saying that. But those are the things that digital natives understand, that when they enter the workforce and all of a sudden they get this guy, you know, they get exposed and they're like, what's this? So it's really important that I'm sorry, that was a big tangent. Sorry. That unstructured data, though, is what provides the answers. So as vendors like SuccessFactors continue to roll out tools like AI and bots that say, I want to take time off, in order to get something back that doesn't sound like, I don't know what you're talking about, you have to have your unstructured data in order. Does that make sense? So my foundation, my foundation has to be anti-fragile, both from a structured and unstructured standpoint. The better my data, the more I'm able to personalize. Does that make sense? The more I know, like I was on a panel in Singapore a couple weeks ago where someone's like, don't you think it's crazy how many of you use Instagram? Yeah. They said, don't you think it's crazy how much Instagram knows about you? Like, it's a violation. I was like, who gives Instagram, there's not like people fat-fingering data at Instagram about you. Like, you're giving it all your data, right? So, like, it's not crazy. How does LinkedIn know all this stuff about you? You're putting it in. So if all of a sudden we get our employees to use these tools, what do we get? Better data, which means we can personalize, we can start to have insights to do amazing things. If our employees don't use the things and they call, and we have to fat finger the data and they get enraged, and we have to enter the data 15 times, what happens? We don't get good data. We get minimal data, which means it makes it very hard to personalize. So if I want to send someone content, like I want to send Lynn content, I know that Lynn I know what she wants to be when she grows up. How do I stay and provide her content every other day that helps her realize that where she's working here is the place for her forever? If I don't know what she wants to be when she grows up, how do I do that? I don't. I struggle. Does that make sense? That's where digitization can come into play to drive engagement. Okay? And if we think about that, I'm not just doing data to get data, I'm getting data to get wisdom. Okay? How many of you are HR business partners here? Okay. So I think I'm going to say this, I think the HR business partner role as we know it today is dead. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean you run away. It doesn't mean you get scared. But people are like, don't you think AI is going to take these people's jobs? I'm like, no. Digital is finally going to get HR business partners into the role of answering questions, from the shift from answering questions to solving problems. Does that make sense? It's finally going to get them to the point where they can actually work with the business or the leaders to use that wisdom. Self-service didn't do it. Digitization is going to do it. Okay? And that's what's so important about the concept of data. And what that means is that we're going to start measuring things like experience. Like, do I care about my employee experience? How do you measure employee experience today? Most people ask on a survey once a year, what's your experience? Right? How does Amazon do it? How does Delta Airlines do it? How do you do it as the government when someone's filing their taxes? Real time. How was the process? You ever go to the airports and have those, like, 5 buttons to push? But was the restroom clean? Does anyone ever do it? Why are you laughing? He's like, I'm not touching that thing. Yeah, I knew that's why I was laughing. I feel the same way. But when you think about it, we're trying to measure experiences in real time. So measuring journeys, measuring sentiment, reinventing call centers. Why are call centers called call centers? Why can't they be called experience centers? Why can't call agents be called experience agents? Why do I focus on deflecting people away from HR instead of getting them to desire to talk to HR? When someone calls from HR, what do most employees think? What? They think it's bad news. That's a terrible thing. Like, can you imagine if every time someone called you, you're like, oh, God. Sorry, I can't talk right now. I mean, how do I shift from deflection to desire and get people to desire to work with the function, to work with the people function that drives this concept of this most strategic asset. Two more concepts, and then we'll open it up for a few questions. Experience is not a user interface, okay? It's very, very important to understand. When we think about our user interface, think about Amazon. If you order from, how many of you like Amazon? Cool. So you order a product. What if it doesn't show up? Good user interface? What's the experience if it doesn't show up? Bad experience. What if you order Uber or Lyft? You might say, hey, I love this app. It's a great user interface. What if the car doesn't show up? Horrible experience, right? What if you go on Tinder looking for a date? Good user interface? What if the thing that shows up isn't what you wanted? Probably bad experience, right? So the user, don't forget that last one. But does that make sense? The user interface is not the experience. The experience is everything that you put into it, the mindset, the people, the process, the technology. So the last concept I'm just going to leave you with really quickly is this concept of an IV. Here's my friend. Hi. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I have your arm? Does everyone know what an IV is? Okay. So think about this for a second. How do you say your name?
Honey.
Honey. Honey, hold out your arm. So as Honey holds out his arm, think about if I want to roll out a new capability to Honey, a new employee value proposition tool. What do? Insert an IV. Then all of a sudden I want to roll out a new training class. What do? Like shoot it through the same IV or insert another IV? Insert another IV. Then all of a sudden I want to roll out a new way to check my payroll, my pay slip. What do?
Get another arm.
Go to the other arm. Then all of a sudden, what do I want to do? I want to roll out a new way to do my expenses. What do? Another IV. Then all of a sudden I want to say, hey, there's a new way to file your taxes. What do? Another IV. Hey, guess what? We have a new portal. What do? Another IV. Look at Honey's arms. They're bruised and battered. Looks like what? No, someone said something. Now, think about your employees. Does that make sense? Think about all of the messages your employees get from you just in HR. Forget the rest of the organization. So when we think about the world of HR technology and experience, we have to think about it differently and say, how do I have one IV? One IV that is the experience layer that whatever it is I'm deploying, value proposition, new talent acquisition tools, new way to think about communication, it's all going through that same IV. And you know what happens when I do that? I shift from this concept of measuring adoption to addiction. People are addicted to the tool. They find the value in the tool, and they keep going back to it. So even if it's something like changing your address every 5 years, they're still going to go back because they know that that one IV is where they go to get everything. Raise your hand if you have that one IV model. Awesome. That is the shift that this whole industry is going through right now that you will continue to strive for going forward. So just in summary, we talked about this concept of digital. It starts with mindset. You have to create that vision. It moves to people. We need to think about our personas and design for them, not for us, and measure their experience. Because guess what? Their experience drives engagement. Their experience drives customer experience. We have to think about how do we reimagine our processes so we're not just rolling out training for compliance purposes, but we're rolling out new ways to keep them engaged and drive them to stay with our company. And if we do that, we think through those three things, then we can finally say, hey, we're ready for the technology. The technology is what's going to fuel us going forward. Okay? So nothing really will change. The best technology in the world, which we have today at our fingertips, our function won't change unless you change. Thank you guys very much for your time. Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. Sir, do you want to start?
Yeah. Can I have your 10% technology?
That's what we're going to talk about the next.
Yes, yes. Other questions? Whatsoever? Anything? Yes?
Thinking of Amazon and other things that we use because of the ease of use, because it's intuitive, but to the extent you work for a federal agency, especially a federal law enforcement agency, we have a lot of other things that we need to be concerned about, right? So we have laws about personal identifiable information, we have, laws about keeping information that's classified, so we have additional challenges.
Yep.
That we don't have when we're dealing with these other vendors.
Right.
Private industry.
Yep. So the question or the comment was, we have additional challenges as government agencies that we don't have when we're dealing with the outside. Now, what's interesting about that is that in various parts of the world, there's tougher laws on the outside marketing and outside consumer than there is on inside organizations. So, my response to that is, how do you think through your processes to expose the things that you can expose? Once again, thinking about that, what do we want to be great at versus what's okay to be okay at? I can still have that data. I can still use that data. I just have to think about how do I use it in a more judicious manner. And one of the things, I'm just going to say this, and you guys can agree or disagree, we make, as every industry, and I'm just going to say this, and once again, someone's going to hate me, I'm sure. Every industry in the world makes up excuses as to why they can't do things. Okay, now I know that you have some, but the healthcare industry does it, the banking industry does it, the retail industry does it. Every single industry has their own things. And what I would beg you to do is not let those get in the way of progress, but do it in a sequenced kind of manner that helps you work through them. Because otherwise we're just going to keep running on ice. And if you can't do it, then don't do it. Spend money on something else. But don't just keep transitioning just to be in the same spot. Thank you for making that comment.
Okay.
Great, thanks very much.